And we're live.
Hello, and welcome to the Modern Romantic Podcast, where we celebrate and inspire romanticism by having a podcast with passionate guests woven with creative silk. Hi, I'm constantly riding the line between genius and insanity. Hi, I'm Trey, and I'm joined by my co-host tonight, Emily. Hi, Emily.
Hi. Today I am frolicking in a field of daisies. Because romanticism.
That sounds really nice. I like that.
Yeah.
I am honestly super excited for our guest this evening. Emily, would you do the honor of introducing our guest tonight?
I would love to. Today we're chatting with a fascinating person. He's a former presidential speechwriter who once had George H.W. Bush cook him breakfast. He was also a CBS News writer, professor, director emeritus for the Center for First Amendment Studies, and author of several books, notably one entitled Romanticism, Rhetoric, and the Search for the Sublime. Please welcome Dr. Craig Smith.
No!
Confetti.
There you go.
Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
I wasn't sure if I should bring up the breakfast, but tell us what it's like hanging out with the president cooking your breakfast.
I was called in for an interview at the Bush household in Houston. And just at that point, I arrived at the Bush household in a three-piece suit, and I was greeted by George H.W. Bush, and he was in an Izod t-shirt. And he said, if you get out of that silly three-piece suit, I'll cook you breakfast. So I took my coat off and my vest off, and I was in the kitchen, and he was cooking me breakfast. And Barbara Bush came in, and he had handed me a cup of coffee. And so I'm standing there drinking a cup of coffee, and Barbara Bush said, George, that man is drinking a cup of coffee and there's no saucer under it. And I don't know what got into me, but I just looked at her and said, Mrs. Bush, I came to your house in a three-piece suit. I wouldn't spill a drop of your coffee. And she laughed and he laughed, and we got along from that point on.
That is awesome.
Just to imagine their faces at that comment, that is spectacular.
Yeah.
So the other thing that that we were mentioning that I'm really interested in, I know our audience is going to want to hear that incredible story of your first speechwriting gig. We know a little bit that you were at the University of Virginia. You went to Chapel Hill. You had an opportunity to hear Gerald Ford give a speech in person, and it turned out rather less than stellar. But then you mailed him a 5-page critique to the White House. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened after that?
Well, yeah, I was, I went to the University of North Carolina to give a guest lecture in the morning, and President Ford was coming to the campus to speak at noon, and so we all went over to see him, and the speech was rather disappointing. It was to the future homemakers of America, and uh, my colleagues, of course, being academics, kidded me about,
The sticks right now.
here you,
You know what?
are,
Let's put some butter on that
a
pan.
Republican, and you support, the president, and he's not a very good speaker. And so, yeah, I wrote a 5-page single-spaced critique of the speech and sent it to the White House. I mean, it was just addressed the president, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and I didn't think anything more of it after that. And then a week later, I got a call from the director of White House personnel. I thought it was a practical joke and refused the call. The call came back, and the person said, you can call me on the White House switchboard and get me that way. And so that's what I did. And then I got in touch with this person, and it turned out that when my letter arrived the next night, the next day, somebody had resigned as a White House speechwriter. And so somebody in the mailroom sent the letter upstairs to White House personnel. They checked me out over the week with other people that I had worked with, and then I started was called up for an interview. And the first person I interviewed with was the director of White House personnel, a guy named Doug Smith, ironically. He then passed me on to Bob Orban, who was the editor for the speechwriters in the White House. And I had a nice session with him, and realized that this process that I was going through was a vetting process. If I failed it at any point, I would be out the door. And so Bob Orban then took me in to meet with Bob Hartman, who was a counselor to the president and the head of the speechwriters. And we had a long talk, but one of the things that Hartman was interested in was how I viewed what a professor brings to the role of speechwriter. And ironically, at that point, this is, in 1976, early 1976, no one with the degree credentials that I had been a speechwriter. They'd all been journalists, or they'd been English professors or novel writers, but they hadn't been speechwriters, which is kind of ironic. So I had a skill set that was different from other people. And I talked to Hartman about that. And then Bob said, the president wants to speak the language of the common man. That's very important to him. And so I said, I don't think that's difficult. You can be eloquent and use simple language. I said, look at FDR. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. There's no big words there. It's the repetition and the alliteration that makes that go. And so it convinced Hartman that I probably could do the job. And he said, just wait here in my office for a minute. And he left. And then he came back and said, come with me. And he took me into the Oval Office. And his office was right next to the Oval Office, which was a good thing. And there was the president smoking on a pipe, Gerald Ford. And Bob Hartman said, pending security clearance, this is Craig Smith. He's a professor at the University of Virginia, and he'll be your next speechwriter. And before I could say a word, the president said, professors haven't done very well here. And I said, well, Mr. President, why is that? And he said, well, they try to make me sound more eloquent than I'm comfortable with, and they never get anything in on time. And so I said, well, I hope I can correct that. I've, been in intercollegiate debate, and I've been a debate coach, and I can hopefully work fast enough to get your speeches done in a timely fashion. And that's how it all started. And eventually, I was assigned a speech as a kind of hazing. The speech was for President Ford to deliver at the Southern Baptist Convention in Norfolk, Virginia. Well, the Southern Baptists were very committed to Jimmy Carter at that
Oh,
time,
sure.
and that's who we were eventually going to run against. And so here you had, me, a Catholic, writing for the president, an Episcopalian, to deliver a speech at the Southern Baptist Convention. So I did as much research as I possibly could and rehearsed the president. We went down to Norfolk. He began the speech. A few minutes in, he was interrupted by applause. He was interrupted by applause 13 more times during the whole speech. The next day, the Washington Star, which was one of the papers in Washington at the time, said, "President hits home run in Norfolk." And so I had credibility and was able then to suggest some changes in the way the speechwriting staff worked. And with every iteration through the summer, particularly the bicentennial, the president got closer in the polls to Jimmy Carter. Which shows you that rhetoric can make a difference over time and in many ways.
Wow. That was really a bold move, though, just writing to the White House like that. I mean, that.
Yeah. Well, only in America, if you sent a 5-page critique to Vladimir Putin, I suspect you'd be in a gulag somewhere.
That would be it for you, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, I love that is your story, because I love that how fearless that shows you were, or at least you had some level of confidence to.
Yeah, I don't know quite what got into me to do that. I think the goading of some of the professors at the University of North Carolina. I was having trouble going to sleep, and so I just thought, I'm just going to write this critique and send it in, and then I'll feel a lot better.
Get it out. Like, your speech was so bad I couldn't even sleep. That's great, though. I love that gumption, I guess. Is you were about to say something, Trey? I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's something along the same lines. Because if I were to walk into the room with the president and then have such a statement as, "Yeah, professors don't last here very long," that would unnerve me. And for you to just kind of fire back with just a lot of confidence, I think even at the time that you wrote that critique, I think says a lot about who you are as a person, and that you are very confident in your skills. And that speaks volumes of the things that you have accomplished. So good on you, sir.
Well, I think what gave me confidence was I was well trained in rhetoric. I mean, I had studied, from first of all, I mean, in high school, I was actually saved by the high school debate coach, because in going into my junior year, I was just a nerd on my high school campus. And counselors put me into the debate program, hoping that I would overcome my shyness. And I remember I didn't want to do it. But that debate coach had a lot of confidence in me. And by the end of the year, I was in the state finals in debate. And the next year, my senior year, I was student body president. So it really kind of turned my life around. And then I continued to study when I was at UC Santa Barbara. Had wonderful professors there, Forbes Hill being the one who taught me Aristotle. And we focused on Aristotle's rhetoric, which is really a handbook on how to make a speech. And it's still used to this day, and it's the best handbook to this day. Now, there's others that have contributed, like Cicero and Quintilian, and in the modern era, there are people like Kenneth Burke and others who have dealt with rhetorical theory. There's the whole Romantic era that I write about in my book with Hugh Blair and De Quincey and people like that. So I had studied it, but the only person I'd written speeches for was myself. I'd never written for anyone else. Until I went to the White House and wrote for the president. And I had no idea how that was going to go.
Josh said in the chat, ooh, a common theme heard from again. A singular influencer changed the course of a life. So tell me about writing a book on Romanticism now, like in the modern age.
Writing a book, what?
About Romanticism.
Ah,
Your book,
you know,
Romanticism. And
yeah. The interesting thing is, I've always been an environmentalist, and as we've continued to head toward catastrophic climate change, I was getting more and more interested in what we could do, and I saw that the people that were trying to convince people of global warming and climate change and so on and so forth were not being effective. It was they were very logical, they were very scientific, and that's all good. But one of the things that I realized was that the Romantics taught us that emotion is also very important if we're going to convince people of things. And so I started doing research on the Romantics and their theory of rhetoric. And one of the first things I realized is they had deep roots going back into humanism. And in fact, I traced their roots all the way back to St. Augustine. So this book is a survey that starts with Augustine and how he inspired the secular movement and also the humanist movement. And then the scholastic movement is a forerunner to the Enlightenment, and the humanist movement into the Renaissance, and so on and so forth. But the other discovery I made while I was doing my research on the book was that there are three figures that we talk about as Enlightenment figures, and I think it's more appropriate to talk about them as bridge figures to the Romantic era. The first is David Hume, and David Hume was all about saying we make decisions based on instincts and emotions, and we rationalize them with logic. We do not make logical decisions. And that's a very romantic notion that he had. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the original back to nature guy. I mean, he argued that we were better people before we got corrupted by civilization, that we were better when we were in nature. And in fact, he's one of the people that started, when he visited England, who started the whole thing of the English garden being very different and very natural, as opposed to the French garden, which is very manicured. And then the third person that I looked at as a bridge to Romanticism was Edmund Burke, the great parliamentarian who was the founder of the conservative philosophy. But he also he also wrote a book. It was based on his dissertation on the sublime. And he said, the beautiful and the sublime are different. The beautiful are things that attract us, and when we attach ideas to the beautiful, that's a good thing because it makes them more attractive. But the sublime is even more powerful because it blows everything else out of your mind and leaves only the thought that you're working with. And he said, the sublime can come from things like, magnificent mountains like the Alps. It can come from things that are scary like volcanoes and earthquakes, because they just chase everything away. And so as a public speaker, what you want to do is reach for the sublime. And there are examples of where that happens. At the end of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, for example, that's a sublime moment that really carried the day. And so that's how I got into the Romantic movement. And the more I got into it, the more research I had to do. There's a whole chapter on Percy Shelley. Mm-hmm. One of the fascinating things about the Romantics is they go across the political spectrum. Wordsworth and Coleridge become much more conservative as they age. And Shelley, of course, is for free love, and Keats is for all kinds of democratic liberal procedures, but they're all romantics. And by that, I mean, they all hated the Industrial Revolution. They loved nature. They teach the sublime. They believe that we have transcendent souls that can become one with nature. And they have various, descriptions of what to them is God. Wordsworth sees God as a manifestation in nature. Shelley is an atheist, but he believes the human mind is God. So there is a belief in the transcendent in all of the Romantics, and I think that's what makes them so special.
For sure, yeah. That's interesting. We had Kurt Ward on the podcast. It's probably been a month ago now, several weeks ago, and he writes a lot about Romanticism as well. And I don't know, Kurt, if you're out there listening, this is his kind of thing. So I hope he is. And he talked a lot about that too. He studied a lot of those same Shelley and Byron and Keats and all of that. Mm-hmm. He talks about how that kind of thing is coming back. It's making kind of a renaissance. And there's a lot more of that we talked about going, like, where is Romanticism today? And I think it just goes by other names. And I was wondering what you thought about that. Like, for instance, some people are calling it cottagecore. We're getting back to farming. And I think the pandemic probably helped with that quite a bit because everybody got back to their home and stayed home and made bread and things like that.
Yeah, and I certainly think that one of the things that I hope to bring out in the book is that we need to return to the Romantic era to educate our own, and that's why I call it the neo-Romantic theory that I come up with, because not only do I take the theory of the Romantics, mainly Hugh Blair and De Quincey, but then I fortify their theory with modern theories of today. And try to reinforce and make it more robust than it was even in the Romantic time. And that takes another couple of chapters in the book to get that all pulled together. So there's a lot going on in terms of the theory I'm trying to advance in order to help people, save the planet, if you will.
Yeah.
Kind of along the same lines of trying to convince those to pay attention to certain issues. There's someone else that I believe that you talk about in your book as well, and that was Galileo and getting the church's acceptance of science. Can you talk a little bit more about your exploration of Galileo in your book?
Yeah, I had written an article about Galileo back a ways as a corrective. One of the things that often happens is people see a movie version of a life, or they see a play version of a life, and you have several plays that have been written about Galileo that it's like he's thrown in prison and tortured because of his scientific beliefs, and none of that ever happened. He was under house arrest at the Medici Palace in Rome when he was there. The reason I talk about Galileo is because he brings the scientific method into the Enlightenment before there's an Enlightenment. So you have people like John Locke, who are lead-ins to the Enlightenment, and Galileo, who's also a lead-in to the Enlightenment. But the other thing that I do point out is Galileo, in some instances, was his own worst enemy. Once he got tenure, he became very arrogant, and in some of the things he wrote, he would go after his opponents, other professors, and he wasn't very nice about the things he said about them. And so once they got the opportunity to go behind the scenes in the Papal Palace and argue that Galileo was really anti-Aristotelian, they could undercut him. I mean, the whole involvement of the Catholic Church with Aristotle is so ironic because they did not embrace Aristotle or any of the pre-Christian writers until Augustine came along. And Augustine said, look, these people didn't have the opportunity to experience Christ. So we don't know whether they would have been Christians or not, but we can certainly, identify what they said as something valuable for us. And he retrieved a lot of Aristotle and Cicero, and that became part of the humanist effort to retrieve these lost and ancient manuscripts and make them part of knowledge. That was one of the great humanist contributions. It was Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s that brought Aristotle back and into teaching. Aristotle was banned at the University of Paris when they were first formed in 1200, and Aquinas fought to get Aristotle into the curriculum. He was so successful, however, that not only was Aristotle's things like the ethics and the metaphysics incorporated into Catholic teaching, but all of Aristotle's science. Well, Aristotle believed that the sun went around the earth, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And so when Copernicus came up with his theory that the earth went around, or the earth went around the sun, and then Galileo proved it, that was anti-Aristotelian. So now you had the church defending Aristotle against Galileo. It's just crazy how those things can happen.
It kind of reminds me of the scene from Robert Pullman's adaptation of I'm really blanking on titles. The first book of his Dark Materials, where the professor's standing in the room and he's saying, things come from dust, and someone remarks, that is heresy. And the professor just responds, that is the truth. One thing that kind of conjures up to me is this kind of idea of fear that comes out of things, and the rejection of an idea because of some potential fear. And from your standpoint, having done so much research from this, what kind of recommendations would you have for people wanting to communicate those ideas and to maybe present a new way of thinking to someone else and overcome some of those potential fears that another person might have?
Good question.
I think that for me, and I think it comes from my debate background, I've always believed in deep research. One of my books, it's a fictional book, but it's got a lot of footnotes and it's all based on fact. And it's called Herod from Hell, and it's Herod, and he's in hell, and he's telling us what happened during his lifetime. And the book started, ironically, as a search for the most authentic version of the four Gospels. And I went in relying on scholars like Mr. Farmer that Matthew was probably the most authentic version of Jesus. It portrays Jesus as kind of a socialist agitator. Mark, however, was the secretary to St. Peter, and so he had a more direct line, unless Matthew was the Apostle Matthew, and we don't really know whether he was or not. And then you have Luke, who was a doctor and affiliated with St. Paul, and he wrote a gospel, and then he wrote the Acts of the Apostles, trying to tell what happened after. And then you have John, who's something of an outlier in all of this. And when I began my research, you had the conventional scholastic position was, here are the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are all in pretty much agreement. John has some things that are different, and that makes us suspect that isn't really John the Apostle. Well, as I did my research, and as other people have done research, it turns out that the things that John said were different, we now know are correct, and that the synoptic gospels were wrong about. The timing of the trial, the whole Passover scene. There's Jesus goes to a place called Bethesda, and there's supposedly 5 gates in, and most scholars up until recently thought that it was a metaphor for 5 ways to heaven. Well, they've discovered Bethesda, and it has 5 gates, and it's in John, but it's not in the other Gospels. So as I worked through that, I became more and more convinced that the Gospel of John was the more authentic of all of them. John being the youngest apostle, it was entirely possible that he waited to write his gospel until after the others because he lived so long. He was imprisoned on Patmos in 96 A.D. And then came back to Ephesus, where he had been the founder of the church in Ephesus, and gave these sermons, which became the book of Revelation. And that's the last gospel. So John has his gospel, he's got the letters of John, and then he's got this apocalyptic book of Revelation where he's a very old man, and that's probably based on sermons that he gave. In the process of that, while I was doing research on John, there were things I learned about Herod the Great that I did not know. And I thought, I'm a fairly educated person, and was raised a Catholic and educated on the Bible, and I should know these things. But there are a lot of things that are not in the Bible that are historically true and about these people.
Sure.
And the fact was, Herod the Great, who was the king of the Jews, was not Jewish. He was an Arab. And I was so taken by that fact that I began to then research Herod and then his offspring. There's Herod Agrippa II, and so on and so forth. And that led to a whole book. But instead of writing the book the way academics do, and I understand why we have to do what we do, and that is, here's one theory, here's another theory, I'm coming down on this side for these reasons, and here's a bunch of footnotes. I decided to write the book the way Harry Shara wrote The Killer Angels, which is about Gettysburg. Harry Shara is a great historian and had just had it with this thing where you have to present each side and debate it all out. He thought that was really boring, and he said, look, I'm just going to write what I think is what really happened. I'm going to invent dialogue and make this a more enjoyable, well-rounded experience, and you'll get to know Gettysburg better.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did with Herod. I put him in hell and have him tell his own story. He runs into Cleopatra, he runs into Mark Antony, he runs into Pontius Pilate. He runs into Martin Luther, who happens to be in hell for some reason. And all of these things then, come together in this novel that I wrote. But everything that I say can be traced somewhere. And so I provide footnotes at the bottom of the page all the way through the novel about Herod. But I think for me, I've always had, I hope, by those long-winded anecdotes, that my approach has always been inductive. I look around for as many sources as I can find, and then try to pull, the truth out of that.
And I love that approach. My concern is, like, when we're trying with this podcast and we're spreading the idea of romanticism, I still, on like a day-to-day basis, find those that are not always as willing as you are to go research for those around them. How do you encourage people on a day-to-day basis to continue that research and discover those things?
Well, I'm a believer in the scientific method, and I'm, as the Romantics studied nature from the point of view of observation. They did not throw out the Enlightenment. They were certainly revolting against the Enlightenment, but they didn't throw out the sound methods of generating hypotheses of close observation of what was going on. I mean, Galileo is all about using his telescopes to verify his theory. And the Romantics were all about observing in nature in an inductive way what's there and how that can contribute to our sense of taste. For example, Hugh Blair says the more beautiful things that you look at, the more you refine your taste. And Blair and Hume and many of the other Romantics did not believe that there were separate notions of beauty. They believed that they were almost Platonic in this sense, that there is an ultimate beauty that we can reach if we just continue to observe beautiful things and figure out why we feel that they're beautiful, whether it's because they're delicate, symmetrical, awe-inspiring. There's just all kinds of different ways to look at that. So observation and induction are very important to me in terms of doing research. And I think that's really important because you have to expose yourself to other people's ideas and other people's research, not only so that you don't write something stupid, but that you refine your own work and make it closer to the truth.
It looked like you were about to say something, Trey.
Nope.
Sorry. I did watch your interview with was it C-SPAN, where you talked about doing the research and how important it was. Like I imagine that when you're doing something like speech writing, that is something you're called to research, like you said, work very quickly, because someone might have a speech tomorrow that you have to somehow prepare for and then refine to the point of being able to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, usually we got more time than a day, although that did happen. I mean, when the Mayaguez was seized by the Cambodian government, one of our freighters, the Mayaguez, was seized by the Cambodian government. The president had to go on television and talk about how we were going to handle that, and then what we could do, and so that speech I had to generate pretty quickly. But the nice thing about being a speechwriter in the White House is you have a staff of 10 researchers under you. Okay. And so anything, you don't have to do the research, they do it. But if you're in like a presidential campaign, very rarely do you have the luxury of having a researcher work with you. Maybe you'll have a graduate intern or something like that, but you generally have to do your own research. And I think what gave me an advantage in the HW campaigns, and later I was in the Pete Wilson campaign and worked in several others, was my debate training. I knew how to do research. I knew how to find the answer to a question. I knew where to go. And this is all before Google. I mean, you're having to call people. You're having to go to the library to get a book. I mean, for God's sake, it's so much easier now.
Microfiche. Yeah. So tell me, I was thinking about how preparing for speeches versus preparing to do like what you did with writing a book. I imagine like writing about Romanticism might be far more enjoyable to you. Do you find that the influence of your preparation for writing about Romanticism affected your own personal life in ways that now you live differently, maybe?
Yeah, I was. I'm lucky. I have a godson who lives in Sussex, England, and that is another way this whole project started. He married a woman whose family has a 100-acre manor that goes back to 1496 in cool. Sussex, and it's only 5 miles from where Percy Shelley was raised.
Oh, neat.
At First Manor there, and I was walking around. I actually went there to marry my godson to his wife and perform the ceremony, which was lots of fun. And they got married at the end of April. And the reason that they wanted to get married at the end of April was that's when all the bluebells are in bloom in Sussex. And I went off and on a hike by myself and was just overwhelmed with the carpets and carpets of these bluebells. It was the most beautiful sights I'd ever seen. And I thought, we've got to save this. There's got to be a way to save this. And that was kind of my inner motivation to start the research into the Romantic movement. And then Shelley's mother was from the town where I was staying. And so then I got into Shelley, and Shelley opened me to Romanticism, and one thing, led to another. You just never know, when something is going to be ready and when something is going to strike you. My latest novel, which was just launched yesterday, as I told you,
Yeah.
Professor Greg, it's a fictional novel about a professor who teaches at the University of Virginia, ironically, and then gets involved and off in his life. I've been working on that for 20 years. It just never seemed right until last year, and then I thought it's ready to go. Whereas other things, like The Call, my book on eloquence in the service of truth, which Michigan State University Press was nice enough to publish with my co-author, Michael Hyde, we were able to knock that out in 8 months. We were just excited about it. Everything came together. It's the fastest book I've ever written. So, I mean, the writing process is really an art form. It's not a science. You just don't know what's going to inspire you. You don't know how the timing is going to go on things. Things can take 20 years. They can take 8 months. You just don't know.
Right. And back to the Bluebells, we spoke recently to Julie Montague, who is an American in the British aristocracy, and she is doing a lot of the rewilding. That's kind of what they're calling it over there with their projects to rewild these areas. And I am like 1,000% on board with that. I love this. And so we talked with her about that a little bit. And kind of along those same lines, I would love to make that happen here more. In fact, I just started gardening more like British gardens here in my own yard for that reason. It's better ecologically.
I actually visited a wilding place.
Oh.
These people had a farm, and it had orchards, and the orchards went bad. But they had enough money, and they are converting the whole place to rewilding it, including bringing wild boar back.
Oh, cool.
There in Sussex. One of the things that was really kind of funny about my visit to Sussex this time, I was just there in May. I went back. I go back every May to see the bluebells, and
that's awesome.
There were pheasants here and there. Pheasants are big, beautiful birds, and my godson said we don't like them, and I said why? And he said, well, they're not native to England. They were native to Asia, and they made their way across Europe, and then they made their way into England. And so an authentic rewilding might eliminate the pheasants. And I said, well, that would kind of be bad. I like the pheasants. They're big and they're beautiful, and sometimes that's part of evolution, that an animal moves from one continent to another.
Yeah, they are beautiful though. I agree. And then back to your book then, your newest book, Professor Greg. Tell us about that.
It's kind of autobiographical, but then it takes some turns that are different than my life. The old adage is you write what you know about, and I guess I know who I am, and I know what I've been through. But it starts at the University of Virginia, and these two people, a professor and a young professor and his student, after the student graduates and the professor becomes a speechwriter at the White House, they go on different career paths but keep in touch with one another. And they go through various, the subtitle of the book is An Existential Journey. And it's a journey in two senses. It's a journey into yourself, and then there's a lot of travel that's involved. At one point, the professor, after his experience at the White House, he gets involved in a Senate campaign in Washington State. And he saves the career of a senator by writing a speech where the senator goes on television and confesses to an affair and asks for the voters to forgive him and withdraws from the campaign. Well, the voters elect him because they like that he confessed his sins. And then after they've celebrated for a while, the professor learns that the senator has gone back to his philandering ways. And so now he has to drive across the country to get back to Washington to start another job. And so this part of the journey is like the Odyssey, where he stops at various points, sees different students, visits his family, and eventually makes it back to Washington, D.C., which has become his home. So it was a fun thing to write and refine, and like I said, it's been 20 years in the works.
I can't wait to read that one. And you can find that now, you said, on Amazon. Is that right?
Yeah, it's you can get it as a Kindle. It's available at Amazon, and Amazon has been nice enough to sell it at a summer sale rate. So the Kindle's probably, I think, like $13, and the paperback's just $20.
And that's Professor Greg with two G's.
Mm-hmm.
For those.
Yeah, the professor's name is Professor Harrison Gregg.
Okay.
And so it's Greg with two G's. There's a famous Gregg family in New Hampshire that got involved in politics, and they kind of, I thought I'd steal that name from them.
And let me just go add this to my cart. Honestly, that honestly does sound like an incredible story. There are, while you were telling me that about that kind of Odyssey journey that he's having, kind of reminds me of in Neil Gaiman's, oh, there I go, losing titles of things. I swear I have my vitamins. I swear I took my memory vitamins today.
But have you been out in nature?
Oh, nature doesn't like me. I'm allergic to everything. Let's see. In a book that Neil Gaiman wrote, that American Gods, there we go. As Shadow and Mr. Wednesday are driving across the country to get where they need to go, they're stopping along some of those places and having that sort of odyssey for Shadow, that main character. I love that style because you get to see so much of a character development, especially when they're by themselves or having someone as kind of a sounding board to them, but they're not directly impacting. They're just kind of there for that one person to kind of talk through their own journey. So that is, I love that, and I can't wait to dive into this a little bit more.
Yeah, I was inspired partly by Steinbeck. I mean, you have John Steinbeck writes Travels with Charlie, where he travels with his dog, and you get some of that. But also, if you look at The Grapes of Wrath, there's some wonderful writing about these people, leaving Oklahoma and making their way across the country on Old Route 66 to California. And that's the first half of The Grapes of Wrath, are these, the roads coming down from Enid, Oklahoma, and going on through to Tulsa, and so on and so forth. And I guess the other thing was, as a kid, when I was 8 years old, my father was in the Navy, and we were in San Diego, which I thought was just heaven. And then he got transferred to Virginia. And we went on this long odyssey up to Seattle to see his mother, and across to North Dakota to see where he was born and where he'd been raised, and over to Minnesota to see his uncle, and down through Indiana. And as we crossed the country, my father kept getting lost. I never understood this, how somebody who, had to navigate ships during World War II couldn't keep a car pointed in the right direction. And we got sidetracked in Illinois at one point. We were in Peoria, I'll never forget it. And I mean, I was just an 8-year-old kid. And I went over to the gas station attendant and I said, "Could you please teach me how to read a map?"
Oh.
My father keeps getting lost, and I want to help him out. So he showed me this map of Illinois leading into Indiana, which we were trying to do, and showed me how to do it. And so I got to ride shotgun. And my mother went into the back seat with my sisters for this experiment. And we're driving, and the sun is behind me. It's getting later. which means that's the west. We're heading to the east. This is not rocket science. I think I have this figured out. And my father starts complaining and saying, I think we're going in the wrong direction. And then suddenly a sign comes up and says, welcome to Indiana. And so we had navigated successfully. And from that point on, I was the navigator. And I began to collect maps and got a terrific interest in geography. For the rest of my life, I've always been very concerned with geography and where things are. And of course, in my old age now, I can visit Europe and see all these wonderful capitals and do all that wonderful stuff.
That's wonderful. Yeah. To repeat wonderful. Yes, it is. That sounds awesome. I've always been interested in cartography as well, like in maps, especially old ones. So yeah, relatable for sure.
Yeah.
What? I'm sorry, Trey. I did it again. We do that. We try to read each other like, is he going to ask? We don't have any of that planned. So it usually works better until this happens. I want to know what part of the creative process for you, writing or any creation, I guess, any creativity of any kind, what part of the process is the most, I guess, the part you get the most excited about?
It became a necessity for me. I don't mind confessing that for a good deal of my life, I was a depressive. And, maybe I can help some listeners along the way. But when I would write, the depression would go away. I think creativity can chase depression away. That's why Winston Churchill painted. That's why George W. Bush paints. That they do it to, and there was a time when I really had to write every day to keep the black dog of depression, to use Winston Churchill's phrase, to keep the black dog of depression away. And I haven't had a bout of depression since 1991.
Wow.
When I started writing a little more intensely. So it is a creative process for me, and it's rewarding when you discover things. I also, want to make clear that teaching is part of the writing process. As you teach something, you work it out. As you talk about things with your students, you work out how you want to present that.
Yeah.
Sometimes the aha moment comes out of the mouth of a student. A student says something that you'd never thought of, and you think, yeah, maybe that is the way that happened. Let's go research that and see if we can revise something. And my career began with revisionism. Some of the things that had been written in my field about Aristotle, when I did research on them, I found that they were not right. They had not taken what they were looking at in Aristotle's rhetoric and contextualized it in terms of his Neo-Machian ethics, or they hadn't contextualized it in terms of his book on the politics, and that changed the meaning of what he was saying in the rhetoric. I mean, there's places where he actually says, go to my book on poetry if you want to bring a scene alive in front of a jury. Go to my book on ethics if you want to understand what it is to have goodwill, which is essential to credibility. And so I was revising. I mean, people said, you can't, as a young man, possibly think you're going to revise our theory of Aristotle. And I said, well, but the truth is the truth. You have him wrong, and I am going to revise it. Maybe nobody will publish me, but luckily there was a journal called Philosophy and Rhetoric, and it published the article, and I was off and running and down the road. So there are just a lot of ways into this whole notion of publishing and creating books.
Go ahead, Trey. Did it again.
We need a sign of like, I'm ready to speak.
Yeah, just
What I was going to say was, to your point a little bit ago in our conversation around Galileo and his presenting of his thoughts to the church and getting those accepted. Um, when we're met with adversity, overcoming that adversity um, takes a lot of courage, but holding fast to when you know something is correct and fighting for that truth and for that justice, I think speaks to the human existence. That was my only commentary. I'm stepping off my soapbox. Emily, I pass it to you.
Thank you. um, I want to know. Speaking of challenges, I want to know what some challenges you faced that you felt made you better in your writing or teaching or any part of your career.
Um, I think that, you know, one of the things that happened early in my teaching, and I think it was a blessing in a sad way. I started as a teaching assistant during the war in Vietnam, and my first full-time job was as an assistant professor at San Diego State in 1969 at the height of the war in Vietnam. And in those days, students were very much interested in life and death issues. People were being drafted, people were being killed. Uh, Students were very serious about ideas, and it was, I think, an ideal time to teach. But also, one of the things that myself and many other professors swore to was making what we were teaching relevant to those students. Why should they care about what we're teaching? How is it relevant today? And when I wrote my book on argumentation, one of my very first books, all the examples are from the debate over the war in Vietnam, whether it's testimony before Congress or presidential speeches or whatever. Every example in that book was about the war in Vietnam. And of course, the war went on for another 3 years, or another 4 years. We didn't get out until 1973, and that made the book and my lectures on argumentation relevant. And I think that's a big challenge for those of us, and it comes all the way forward to the Romantic era. How do we make our concerns about the environment relevant to people who are worried about simply surviving on the street, or simply, where am I going to get my next meal? That becomes a real challenge when you're saying, by 2050, your city may be underwater. Well, who cares about 2050? I'm trying to make it to the next day.
Yeah.
And so this issue of relevance, I think, is a really important one and a big challenge.
Yeah. What ways have you found to reach people with that message? Does anything work?
Yeah. I think as the environment touches people more, and we could, there's this whole theory in rhetoric about proximity, and Aristotle was one of the first people to talk about it, and that is, if you want somebody to fear something, you need to find a way to bring it as close to them as you possibly can. I'm not afraid of a Kodiak bear in Alaska. It's nowhere near me. But if the bear is on my porch, then I'll do something. So, how do we put these issues on people's porches? How do we get these issues into their houses? How do we, and one of the ways I found that's effective is to talk about how it's going to affect your children. I've talked to people, who are thinking about having children, and I said, why? Why in the world would you bring a child into this world that's deteriorating so fast? And suddenly that strikes them, and they, instead of having a child just to make me happy, you need to think about, is that child going to make it to 50 years old in a world that's burning up? And so I think that's a big challenge to those of us who are trying to save the environment, is to make it as relevant as possible, to bring it as close to ordinary people as we possibly can. and with all of the other stuff that's going on in the world, it's a tough fight.
That's one of the things that we, like in my corporate job, we talk a lot about adult learning theory and association to things that they know or things that are immediate to their situation really drive change and really drive the learning process. Um, yes, in different contexts, but for me, that just kind of struck back to that concept of like adult learning theory and a few other a few other moments from what you were just saying. For me, what are some other things you've mentioned? Bringing up kids or their immediate situation. What are some other tactics that you've used in your conversations?
Um, you broke up a little bit there. Can you repeat
Oh,
that for me?
sure. Um, you've mentioned that in your conversations, you've mentioned some things that are pretty immediate to their situation, or more specifically, kids. What other tactics have you used in those conversations to bring their attention to thinking towards the future?
Yeah, I mean it's making it real. And I think what you want to do is deal with depictions that will move people. In my book, one of the things I write about, one of the examples I single out, is what Disney has done for the environment. Um, Forget what you think about Walt Disney or the company itself, but the products that they have produced, and I focus on Bambi because I remember it as a little kid watching the movie and being horrified by you know that whole animated cartoon where the mother's killed. I mean, it's pretty scary for a kid to watch Bambi, for the first time, but it makes a terrific argument for preserving the environment and for preserving animals. All through the works of Disney, there's this protection of the environment and this protection of animals by making them, anthropomorphizing them, making them into
Mm-hmm.
people, giving them personalities. Even the old Mickey Mouse Club, when kids came home, during the Mickey Mouse Club, there were often documentaries about pumas and wild animals and squirrels and so on and so forth. It's a remarkable record if you look at the way that Disney reached people by giving personalities to things that really didn't have them. Thumper, the rabbit in Bambi becomes a lovable creature, and it changes your opinion of rabbits. So there's lots of ways to get to people and to make things relevant in our literary arsenal. I'm just trying to hype it up a bit by bringing us back to the Romantics and then recharging that battery with some of the modern theories that we know work. For example, Walter Fisher, one of the things the Romantics are big on is narrative storytelling. There's a point at which Hume, for one, many other people say this, but Hume, for one, says, a good story beats a good argument. Um, you
Yep.
can be logical, you can have all the facts,
Hmm.
but it's how you put the facts together and how you tell the story that becomes important. So I spent some time on narrative building. And I'm someone who came out of you know college debate, intercollegiate debate, believed in argument. You get evidence, you make your argument, you make your case. Um, but it's still stronger to tell a good story and to make sense out of facts. And that's one of the things that we should learn from the last election. Um, if you look at certain facts,
Hmm.
it's very hard to make sense out of them. Uh, Joe Biden got more votes for president than anyone has ever gotten. He's not charismatic, so that didn't make a lot of sense to people. Donald Trump got many more votes than he got the first time he ran, and he still lost the election. So making sense out of that was very difficult for Trump supporters. So the conspiracy was easy to weave. There had to be some votes pushed into the machine. Biden never would have gotten that many votes if the election were honest, and so on and so forth. So that narrative, and many conspiracies, survive because their narrative is so strong. They make better sense of the facts than the real story makes. That's why I think we have to become much more skilled at narrative and storytelling, so that we can explain why these things happened the way they did, and undo some of the conspiratorial stories. And you had that with global warming. I mean, people saying the stuff is made up. The thermometers around the world have been re-rigged to up the temperature, and there were just so many ways to destroy the truth with conspiratorial narratives, and we have to get as good at storytelling as the conspirators are, or we're going to fail, massively.
Yeah, two other stories that came to mind that are similar to the Bambi one were Pocahontas and Dr. Seuss with the Lorax, with the tree.
Yes.
That's one that always hit home for me.
Yeah.
And now I have the music from Pocahontas stuck in my head.
That's easy for me too. I was a nanny when Pocahontas came out on video, and the little girl I used to be a nanny for, that's all she wanted to watch. And so I know that one inside and out. Yeah. Not a bad one, though.
No, historically inaccurate, but musically beautiful.
Well, and the message, I think, behind it was still sound.
Very much so.
That's really what I think mattered there.
Especially if, kind of thinking through, because I was actually listening to songs on like just a mixed playlist on my way home, and the opening lines of Colors of the Wind kind of popped into my head. That's what I really went to. Or Just Around the River Bend are very, very prominent in my brain at the moment. What I'm kind of intrigued by for you, Craig, is when you look at this whole process, what is one thing about what you do that makes you just stand up and go, yes, I want to do this. I love what I do.
I'm not sure. I think it's important that we do things that matter, and it's gotten tougher lately to ferret out the truth. But I in the book The Call, we write about at one point we write on the McCarthy era. Joe McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, a Republican, who in 1950 takes all of these facts and puts them together into his narrative. You had in 1948, the Undersecretary of State was convicted of perjury for saying he'd never been a member of the Communist Party. In 1949, China falls to the communists. In 1949, again, Russia gets the atom bomb. In 1950, people are convicted of spying for the Soviet Union. And so McCarthy comes along and says the real problem to explain, after our great victory in World War II, how could we have all these losses? And the reason is there's subversives in the State Department. And I have a list in my hand of 250 subversives. Now, what he waived in that speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, when he said that, was his laundry tag from his hotel room. He had no names on any list at all. And when he gave the speech a few days later in Salt Lake City, he saw Heinz 57 varieties on his table and then he said, there are 57 communist subversives in the State Department. Now, the thing, I mean, the horror of this was this led to the destruction of many lives. People were blacklisted if they'd ever been a member of the Communist Party in the 30s, when it was okay to be a communist, and during World War II, when we were allies with the Soviet Union against the Nazis and so on and so forth. And then all of that turns around, and suddenly we have this man, that produces libraries taking books off the shelf, not only here, but in American embassies. Roy Cohn, who worked with McCarthy and later became a lawyer for other questionable figures, went to U.S. embassies around the world and told them what books they should destroy, and they destroyed them. I mean, this was incredible. Professors on campuses, if they took the Fifth Amendment when they were called to testify in Congress, were fired, even if they had tenure, with the exception of Harvard. Harvard's the only place that didn't fire them. I mean, it was a really terrible time. And so how do you break through that? He went on for 4 years doing these things, and nobody could break through. He was attacked by Henry Luce, who was the head of Time Life. They ran editorials against McCarthy. Nothing happened. Senator Margaret Chase Smith, a wonderful Republican woman from Maine, gave a speech on the floor of the Senate attacking McCarthy. Nothing happened. Edward R. Murrow did documentaries attacking McCarthy and showing that he doctored pictures and all of these awful things. Nothing happened. Then in the summer of 1954, we had the Army McCarthy hearings. McCarthy went too far. He said that now the Army was full of communist subversives, and there were hearings held that were nationally televised. And still, McCarthy was doing just fine, and then McCarthy attacked an aide of the lawyer for the Army. The lawyer for the Army was named Joseph Welch. He had an aide named Fred Fisher. McCarthy accused Fisher of having been a member of a Communist Front organization. Joe Welch then unloaded on McCarthy in an emotional, almost tearful speech about how McCarthy had destroyed this young man. And at the end of it, Welch says, at long last, Senator, have you no mercy? Your forgiveness is going to have to come from someone other than me. And he got up and he walked out of the room, and it burst McCarthy's balloon. It's a romantic moment.
Yeah.
It is a moment when emotion breaks through the phony narrative that this man had been put out. His popularity immediately began to decline. The next month, he was censored by the United States Senate, and he died of alcoholism in old age. But it took 4 years for something to happen, for someone finally to find a way to pierce through the armor and the story and the conspiracies that McCarthy had built up. And I think that's one of the things that rhetoric can do, and particularly romantic rhetoric, and do it on behalf of the environment.
Wow. Yeah. Storytelling matters. I mean,
Yeah.
we're both speechless now. We hear that it's a common theme here in the podcast. We've noticed, and subscribe wholeheartedly to that storytelling does matter. We've had storytellers on. Every author is a storyteller. Everybody is a storyteller to some degree, and I love the title of the call, that book, because the subtitle is Eloquence in the Service of Truth, and that right there makes me want to read the book. I haven't read it, but now I'm going to.
It's really Michael and I started writing together early in his career. He's a little bit younger than I am, but he's also retired. And he came to me 2 years ago with the idea for the book and said, at the end of my career now, I'd like to write a book with you. And we talked about it, and it's the book that came so easily to us. The first chapter looks at the sublime and what it is. The second chapter just reviews what eloquence is. I mean, from Aristotle to Quintilian to Cicero to the modern day. Then the third chapter looks at what we call cheating eloquence, and it looks at two examples of how eloquence can be used for the bad, like the McCarthy example I gave. Then it goes into some examples that are positive uses, and it's bipartisan. We praise Barack Obama for his eulogies, particularly the one he gave in Tucson for Gabby Giffords. I think that's a magnificent speech, regardless of your party identification, where he uses each of the victims to illustrate a virtue that we should have. Magnificent speech.
Yeah.
We look at Mitt Romney's condemnation of Trump in his vote, the first Republican to vote for the impeachment of Trump. We look at the rhetoric of Daniel Webster. We eventually conclude the book by looking at Annie Dillard, because she's got such an appreciation of nature. I mean, she just loves nature, and she's the fitting conclusion to that book. But yeah, it also, I think, is about my favorite topic, true eloquence.
Yeah.
I think the thing that I've heard, and given some of the questions we've asked and some of the topics that we've had, this has honestly changed my perspective of speeches that I give. I tend to be very rambling, I will admit. People who have listened to this podcast, I know.
I do not agree, but okay.
Well, thank you.
We'll debate right here. Craig, you're on my team.
But it does change the way that I think about speeches and how personal that they can be. They don't always have to be about facts. They can have a little bit of personality to them, because we inject that little bit of storytelling to that, and that tells a lot about who we are as a person. What I'm struck by the most is your presentation of it in a very objective way, given even all the political things that we've discussed tonight. You have presented it in a way that is very clear, and it's very analytical to say, but it's also with a lot of heart of how to make it. I can't really find the words to end what I'm trying to say, but there's so much more to what you're saying than just this analytical. It is a lot of heart. It's a lot about the human condition, and it's trying to reach across and reach to other audiences without being attacking. It's inviting a conversation. It's not pushing a narrative. It's pulling one from both sides.
Yeah, I think there's some wonderful women who have written about invitational rhetoric. That rhetoric should want to bring you in, not attack you. And they have kind of designed that as a separate genre of rhetoric. And I think a great example of that I used in my classes, Jesse Jackson ran very well in the primaries in 1984. He didn't get the nomination, but when you run well in the primaries, you're invited to speak as the party reunites. And Jesse Jackson got up and gave what is now called the quilt speech. And he was talking, his message was, we Democrats win when we're united, we lose when we're divided. And Jackson was sensible enough and a great orator in his own right, no matter how you feel about him or his politics, but he knew that you have to say something 3 times before it sinks in. We know from research that people, when they're listening to a speech, they hear about 30% of it, and that's it.
Wow.
And so good speakers will repeat their message in different guises. one of the, what Jesse Jackson does is he talks about unity of he and Michael Dukakis, who has been defeated by, and looks at that unity, and then he looks at another kind of unity, and then he gets to this thrilling conclusion where he talks about how his grandmother took pieces of cloth that were rags and sewed them together into a quilt. And he says, teachers, your patch isn't big enough, but if you join it with ours, it can be more powerful. Farmers, your patch isn't big enough, but if you join it with ours, it can, so on and so forth. And it's just a tremendous dramatic moment at the convention, and the best speech at that convention, in my opinion, because of this ability of him to tell the story 3 times in 3 different guises. Shakespeare does this, if you ever want to see a really good example, in Julius Caesar, where Mark Antony finally gets to speak after Caesar's been assassinated. And it's a very clever speech in which Mark Antony makes his point 3 times that, these honorable men, they killed Caesar and they're all honorable men, but, Caesar did this, and they're all ready to run off and riot and tear the conspirators that assassinated Caesar to pieces. He says, wait a minute, I haven't read Caesar's will. And he takes this ring off this thing and opens this thing up, and Caesar, of course, to every citizen 50 drachmas, and to all my property is turned over for parks, and so on and so forth. So by the end of the speech, or the beginning of the speech, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. What a lie. I mean, the speech is just ironic as hell. He comes to praise Caesar, not to bury him. And by the end of the speech, he succeeded, and civil war goes on afterward. And I think those examples are kind of fun to, try to get the president of the United States to give a speech like that. It can be tough, but if you can get the president to do it and it succeeds, then you get credibility and you can do some more things.
Did you watch every speech that you helped prepare be executed?
I wasn't there for every one of them.
Okay.
For example, when I worked on the speech that President Ford gave in Kansas City, which was one of his very best speeches, but I had stayed back at the White House, and the other people who had worked on the speech also were there. That's a whole nother thing that's kind of funny about speechwriting. Sometimes you can tell that there's more than one speechwriter. One of the most successful, I'll tell you that this was a greatly successful speech, but I didn't think it was going to be. In 1988, when he accepted the nomination for president, George H.W. Bush gave a speech that, by any measure, was one of the most effective acceptance speeches ever. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying it's effective. This is what I mean. He went into that speech 10 points down in the polls to Michael Dukakis. He came out of that speech 7 points ahead. That's a 17-point swing.
Wow.
Before and after the speech. This is the speech where he says, "No new read my lips, no new taxes."
Oh, right.
I didn't write that line. Dick Gold wrote that line. He talks about 1,000 Points of Light. That was written by Peggy Noonan. Peggy Noonan had originally written the line for Ronald Reagan, 1,000 Sparks of Light. So she plagiarized herself and put it into the speech. My contribution was A Kinder, Gentler Nation, which I had put in a speech that Bush gave in 1980 in Philadelphia, and called that up. But if you look at that speech, because speeches are invisible, I think nobody catches this. But if you sit down with a bunch of scholars or students, it's really fun, because you have at some points in the speech George H.W. Bush being a tough guy. No new tax, read my lips, no new tax. Clint Eastwood detective kind of guy, Dirty Harry. And then you have this kinder, gentler man who is the real guy. And, you should have one consistent persona in a speech, not 2 or 3. But he got away with it in that case.
Fascinating.
So one question for those that are either current speechwriters, current authors, or looking to fulfill their aspirations in some sort of writing capacity, what advice do you have for them?
Well, one, the art of writing is rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. When you eliminate the big mistakes, you see the little mistakes. When you eliminate the little mistakes, then you can start choosing words more carefully. You're going to choose words more carefully the bigger vocabulary you have. So you need to develop a big vocabulary, read good things. And, you need to develop a sense of style. Read Hemingway. It's just great stuff. It's no accident that Hemingway's works are made more successfully into movies than any other author. I mean, you just look back at The Old Man and the Sea, The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Killers. I mean, it's a magnificent way that he has plugged into people's ears, and so another way to become a good writer is to read good writers.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham Lincoln was once asked, how were you able to write such good speeches? And Lincoln's speeches are beautiful, particularly his inaugural addresses. And Lincoln said, I read Shakespeare and the King James version of the Bible. Now I'm a Catholic, but I can tell you that the most beautiful version of the Bible is the King James version, and it'll give you a sense of word choice that will help you develop as a writer yourself.
Good advice.
That's very good advice. One of the other thing that I would just like to ask, for our audience, if they would like to connect with you in some way, what are some ways that our listening audience can get in contact with you, potentially hire you to come out of retirement to write a speech for them?
Well, if they're on a campus and they want me to come in and guest lecture, I'm delighted to do that. I don't do much speech writing anymore, but I love to come and lecture on campuses, and I've had a lot of fun doing that. You can give out my email address if you'd like. I mean, it's just craig.smith@csulb.edu, and CSULB is California State University, Long Beach. So, and I think I'm easy to find. I'm also on Instagram under, I think it's _ the rhetor, something like that.
Okay, we'll find it.
Yeah.
And you can follow Craig's. It's Craig R. Smith on Amazon as an author.
Yes, and I have done Zooms to campus to answer your question there.
Oh, yes. You can do Zoom sessions too.
Yeah.
Perfect.
That's great.
If you visit Lisa, yeah.
If you visit Lisa.
Yes. Yes.
We love Lisa. She is great.
We love Lisa.
Yeah.
Craig, this has been an incredible time. You have such a worldly perspective when it comes to everything that we've discussed here today. This is going to be a frequent visit for me to listen to this podcast again, just to remember all the wonderful advice that you've given and all the stories that you've had to tell. So thank you again so much for being on tonight.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I could sit and chat for hours. This was fascinating for me, and yeah, thank you for being here.
Well, it's almost 6:30 on the West Coast, and 6:30 on the West Coast means it's martini time.
Oh,
so I want you guys to have and your audience, everyone in your audience, to go have a martini for me, because I'm going to have a martini for each and every one of you.
Oh, and then we get to have the really fun political discussions.
This was for each one. This is the only time I've ever kind of hoped that maybe we didn't have a lot of listeners for your sake. But maybe that's okay. Well, our video audience here is loving this and saying cheers and martini. Everybody is on board with that. So All right.
Well,
Good.
Enjoy your evening.
Okay. You too.
well, as we close this episode out tonight, this episode, along with probably every other episode, is always going to be dedicated in memory of Joe Capone, our moderator, fellow comedian, passionate encourager, and greatly missed friend. Find us pretty much wherever you tune into podcasts. For updates, announcements, and more, please follow us on social media under Modern Romantic and help us reach our subscriber goals. Thank you, everybody, and go have a martini.
That's right. Go have a martini.
Bye. Bye,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.